Folks, you're with Tassos today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about one of my pet peeves, along with stacking the courts with activist judges, arbitrary ideological law, and the politicians all being globalist flunkies and stooges. But added to that list of pet peeves is the way globalist-controlled politicians and globalist-controlled financial sector actively aid and abet the inflation of residential real estate pricing. Now, I've mentioned this many times before, but just to sort of come back to it, that a house that was sold in Sydney in the year or 2023, 25 years ago for $400,000 sells today for $2.2 million. I just want to give you, so over 25 years, the price of the house has increased by over 500% in 500% in over 25 years. Now, if that house, the price of the house had kept in line with wage inflation, so it had kept in reasonable approximate lockstep with wages, it would be, say, somewhere between $750,000 and $810,000, $820,000 maybe. But no, it's $2.2 million. So that just goes to show you the extent to which real estate inflation, and that's in a middle range suburb. If you look at housing in the more desirable suburbs, the preferenced postcodes, if you will, where the well-to-do live. If you bought a house 5 years ago for $3 million, there today it'd be worth $5.5 million, just over those last few years. So that's getting close to doubling just in a few years there. So there's different rates of, so the minimum. Well, not quite the minimum, I guess. There's a small cluster of homes in the least desirable suburbs, where your house is next door to the methadone clinic and you need to have bars on all your windows, that sort of thing. And people defecating in your front yard, those sort of places, they haven't appreciated the same rate, but there's not vast areas of Sydney that are in that category. So now, there's a whole range of instruments and measures and policies and so on that the Western governments could take to stop this runaway appreciation. But instead, they do the virtual opposite. Or if they do something, they make the announcement. But the reality is, and like we see in Britain, they talk to, we're going to cut back on illegal immigration, we're going to do this, and we're going to get tough on, we're going to, but in reality, nothing happens. It's just quietly left, and they just use the announcements to indicate they're doing something. But in reality, they do nothing at all. And the same is in Australia, or indeed elsewhere around the Western world. Wherever you see this double talk, then it's a globalist-controlled government. It's not representing you anymore. It's representing the globalists. And the globalists want real estate, residential real estate that appreciates much faster than wages, because that destroys standard of living, it destroys people's future, and it destroys or prevents people having a stake in society and these sorts of things. And that's what the globalists want. And it makes people, disillusioned. Oh, I've got no future, so I might as well just accept any fate that's meted out to me, which is, again, very much how the globalists want it to be. So just having a look at the only people that raise this in Parliament or in the newspapers or anywhere like that are the minor parties that maybe only have, out of the representatives in the 450 odd federal representatives in Parliament, the minor parties that mainly hold 2 or 3 positions. Or have 2 or 3 representatives in the wider parliamentary system. They're the only ones that are asking any questions, and the major parties really don't give a fuck. They are so totally bought into the globalist thing of inflate the crap out of the residential real estate, and thus dispossessing their their fellow citizens and fellow Australians out of any stake in the future. I mean, how can anybody want to do that? That's insane, isn't it? You're supposed to represent these people, but of course they don't. Now, in Australia, and this drives me sort of, again, it's one of my pet peeves. At any one time, there are long-term, wait for this, long-term vacant properties in Australia representing about 10% of the total housing stock. Now, I think there's a ratio of 2.6 people per house or per dwelling. It could be an apartment or a freestanding house, but I think it's 2.6 people. So if you look at the amount of properties, the amount of people, there's a million properties rather that are sitting vacant at any one time. Now, this is long-term vacant. The figures seem to vary a little bit, so I found it hard to get a precise number. So it's if it's vacant for more than 90 days. Now, there could be other reasons for the vacancy. The place could be uninhabitable, for example, or say there's a major renovation or rebuild going on, and therefore the people can't live in it, or it could be, say, a weekend property where people go to spend their weekends, or maybe their holiday home, or these sorts of things. So now the government talks tough about, we're going to introduce a tax on the property. So if it's vacant for 90 days or 90 days or greater, you have to pay 1% of the value of the property in a tax. So say, say for example, you've got $1 million property, or that's the assessed value of it, then you'd have to pay $10,000 a year in tax if it's vacant. Now, that to what extent that's applied, if at all, and whether or not it's tax deductible off other income to offset or what, I haven't gone into. I didn't want to spend the time on it. If it's even enforced at all, I'd be surprised. So something needs to be more vigorous there. Why are 10 fucking percent of the total dwellings in the country are empty? Now, again, there could be reasons for that. For example, it's a weekend property, but it's during a rental sort of crisis where the price of rent. There are people who are paying 50, 60, 65% of their income just in rent. That's how expensive rent is, and how so very few of the new jobs that this globalization economy is creating in Australia, or the West generally, have very few jobs are paying enough to live even a lower middle class lifestyle. So, other thing, the government has said, well, we've made it tough for people. This is offshore investors to buy existing property. So it's not new property; it's existing property. So we've made that tough. So the government claims, that is absolute fucking nonsense. The reality is that these offshore investors just use local nominees. The Chinese and the Indians and others, the Russians and so on, are famous for this. They'll send over some flunky to get citizenship or residency, and then that person will buy 10 properties, even though they may not speak a word of English and have an income of half the minimum income, even if they got their cleaners or dishwashers or their doing lawn mowing, and yet they've got a portfolio of prime real estate on that. Of course they don't have that. So these sorts of things are widespread. So you've got entire suburbs that are owned by these nominees who own property on behalf of the offshore investor. The same is for the big investment firms like the BlackRocks and so on that are doing that by buying up vast swathes of property. So the reality, there are no checks, there are no limits on offshore foreign investment. Technically, if a foreigner who gets residency, say they've come to Australia to study or a short-term work visa or something like that, technically, that when they leave or their residency expires, they're meant to either sell the property or rent it at a commercial rate. But this is stacked. They'll just stack it they'll just bring in a whole bunch of peasants from offshore and from their own country, and stack them in 50 to a room and all this sort of stuff, and then make up bodgy fake rental income numbers and figures, and say, so oh no, we rented the place, and even that's not policed particularly well. So the person could probably have an empty property there for at least 12 months before any questions would get asked. So we've got a real estate, like a residential real estate, which is meant to be homes for Australians to live in. They're not meant to be fucking investment properties, but they've been turned into it particularly by globalization. So, or the policies pursued by governments that are controlled by the globalists. That's maybe a better way of saying it. So anyway, so the prices are much higher than they need to be. So save 10% of. I just got distracted for a moment there. We feed some of the local parrots that come out of the forest, and I make a joke that every time I go to do video, they turn up wanting to get some seeds, and of course they've just turned up now. So, but anyway, these are the measures. So the government could clamp down on offshore investment and using nominees if they wanted to, but they don't. They could clamp down on allowing people to buy property just when they're short-term residents or students, but they don't clamp down on that. They could vigorously enforce, they'll vigorously enforce somebody using the wrong pronouns, then there are vast resources to that. They can vigorously oppose, Nazis are everywhere. We're the law enforcement authorities there. We have put all the resources into getting Hitler, but they're completely unable to stop or prevent or limit this sort of thing. And they really don't. And it's obvious they don't give a shit that they want this to go on. So I did some sort of back of the envelope numbers here that if those properties were put up for rent, or the million vacant properties were put up for rent, or they were taxed, quite vigorously, as in an increasing sort of sliding scale of tax, and a bona fide, somebody renting it who was, not a family member doing fake invoices or something like that, then that would have a huge effect, because the holiday, the vacation homes. The people, assuming they're vacation, they tend to be clustered in areas like, outer suburbs along beaches and so on. But what we're really looking at is vacant properties in cities or the greater metropolitan area. Now, the amount of homes only goes down slightly when you say, well, just the cities. So it shows that the holiday homes are not a big deal here at all. So there'd be easily 800,000, give or take, 800,000 homes. And again, these could be apartments or standalone property, freestanding properties. 800,000 homes could come onto the market in areas that are certainly in need of extra stock. Now, if nominees weren't permitted to buy properties, existing properties, offshore investors buy existing properties, then this would lower the turnover of properties, because the properties are going up in price quickly, and then new owners are coming in and buying them. They have to then charge much higher rent. So you're looking at the increase in rent is in part driven by the increase in property prices that in turn is brought about by these artificial shortages of properties that are caused by the influx of foreign investors. So there's a whole lot. So the rents could easily be brought down by my estimation, doing these numbers of these properties are brought on the market if the offshore investors were prevented from buying it, and particularly prevented from and one of the tricks that the offshore investors use is they'll advertise the property for rent for double the price that anybody could afford to pay or would pay for that area. They get no takers, so they say, well, look, we're advertising, no one, we're not getting any takers for rent, so they don't have to put a competitive price in there. They're allowed to charge these silly prices, which means they're allowed to keep it vacant and not pay the tax. All these scams. The thing about the bringing in all these people from overseas is that they believe our systems and process and everything here are there to be exploited. And this is something that we tend not to do to each other. I might say, if somebody, if someone in the neighbourhood, someone I know, I don't want to screw them over. I don't want, they're fellow citizens, they're neighbours, they're I want to be on good terms with them, and so on. So I don't, even if the opportunity were there, I wouldn't exploit them and take advantage of them simply because of that. These people coming offshore have no compunction whatsoever. We're here to be exploited, and they've come to take and not to give or to share. They've come to take, and that certainly is reflected in their behaviour at all levels. Now, why is this, you may ask? Well, there's globalist policy, big finance, and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is that our political class now and our senior public servant class, all their, the majority of their income comes now from real estate speculation, and that puts them, right up the arse and hand in glove with the financial sector. So these banks will wheel the politician into buying a property for example, $1 million, and then we'll hook them up with a super cashed up Chinese buyer who a year later will pay $3 million or $4 million for the property that really is only not even worth half that. And so the politician will realise a windfall profit in just 12 months. And before you know it, a few property flips down the track, all neatly and carefully and politely arranged by the bank, a few property flips down the track. Then they're quite well to do. They're living in a very nice area in a very nice house, something they couldn't dream of affording on their parliamentary salary. And so, or investing in property to rent and these sorts of things. So the political class is now totally in bed with the property speculation, the property and banking class, and again realizing the most of their income out of it. So that's why they've really got no interest at all. Anything to dampen down real estate prices is taking money directly out of the pockets of those politicians, and so they have no interest. Which again, it clearly illustrates the fact that they represent the globalists now, and not the people that they purport or claim in their oath of office to serve. And what a fucking outrage! I mean, seriously. So that's where it's at. But again, this is one of my pet peeves. And rent, for example, would be a third of what it is today, if rents had kept in line with wage growth. So we'd all have a very high standard of living in Australia, or the West generally, if real estate and energy and so on, rents and purchasing property had stayed more or less in line with wages. Then we would all be living a very high standard of living here in Australia and elsewhere around the West. And also people would be procreating more readily, having families and so on. So the difference in the society that we're in, the difference would be staggering if globalization hadn't taken place. And one of the most central components of that globalization has been the runaway inflation in home prices. And I would argue this has been purposefully contrived in order to reduce the standard of living, in order to give and ensure that Western citizens come to the realization they actually have no future if they can't afford to get married, can't afford to have children, can't afford to buy property, and these sorts of things. They have no stake in the future. So they'll just glumly and meekly accept any fate that's dished out to them, which is just how the globalists want it. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.